So, I want to talk to you guys about Canada, the state we're in right now, and where it all started. First, before we do that, we need to talk about what Canada was before the Union. It was essentially a group of colonies. And in 1670, King Charles II signed into law the Hudson Bay Charter. The Hudson Bay Charter granted his cousin Rupert dominion over what was called Ruperts Land, which you've all heard of. That's why it's called Ruperts Land. It was the area surrounding the Hudson Bay. It's written exactly in the document. It goes from one area to another. It was most of Canada, essentially. And this charter granted permission for the corporation to run a country, essentially. It allowed them to create laws, to enforce those laws, to create courts, to be able to enforce those laws. It had a dominion on everything. If you wanted to do any trading with the natives legally, you had to go through the Hudson Bay Company. The kicker to this document is it was signed by King, obviously, King Charles II. It was signed in perpetuity, meaning that it remains active and valid through its successors and heirs. So, fast forward to 1867. Now we have the Union. Queen Victoria is sitting on the throne. She signs into law the British North American Act. This created our dominion and granted us authority to create parliament, which means we have the authority to create our own laws and to enforce them, to have courts and the like. This was essentially going into competition with the Hudson Bay Company because they were doing the same thing. The only difference was the Hudson Bay Company is a corporation. The Parliament was meant to be, as it were, a parliament. So that competition didn't last very long because a year later, in 1868, the Ruperts Land Act was passed. The Ruperts Land Act was a demand and accepting of the surrender of the Hudson Bay Charter to the Queen. The surrender was written so that it was surrendered to Queen Victoria and her successors and heirs. Remember, the document, the Hudson Bay Charter, was written in perpetuity, remaining in succession and heirs as well. Now it's been given back to Queen Victoria in 1868, and it is given to her, surrendered to her, her successors, and her heirs. Now we go to 1893, the Statute Law Revisions Act. Queen Victoria is still on the throne. It's 20 some odd years later. She passes the Statute Law Revisions Act, an act to repeal redundant acts. So, first bill on the schedule to be repealed, the British North American Act. That might surprise you. It surprised me when I found it out too. So she didn't just repeal the entirety of the act. She repealed a list of sections, but the two main ones I'm going to talk about. She repealed the Enacting clause. I'm going to read you the Enacting clause off the British North American Act, and it is virtually word for word the same in almost every bill, as it were. Be it therefore enacted and declared by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. So that is the Enacting clause that was in the British North American Act when it was signed in 1867. In 1893, she repealed that Enacting clause. Now you might say to yourself, that sounds like a bunch of fancy words. And it did have the word by my authority. But what does it really mean? The rest of the bill is still there, right? So why does it matter if she took a paragraph out? So again, we go to the Government of Canada's website, and this is their website specifically for detailing the legislative process and for defining sections of bills. The enacting clause is defined as follows. The enacting clause is an essential part of the bill. It states the authority under which it is enacted. And then it goes on to give you an example of what an enacting clause sounds like, which is what I just read for you. So the essential part of the bill that states the authority under which the bill is enacted in its entirety was repealed in 1893. Remember, this is the British North American Act, the act specifically granting permission for us to run our nation as a dominion. As well as the enacting clause, she also repealed Section 2. Section 2 is the Provisions Act. That reads as follows. The provisions of this act referring to Her Majesty the Queen extend also to the heirs and successors. So not only did she remove the enacting clause, which is what gives the authority to the bill, she also removed any mention of her successors, and heirs from the bill. The British North America Act lost its authority in 1893 when the Queen repealed the enacting clause of the bill. On top of that, she also removed herself and her successors and heirs from the bill. This is a problem. How do you know it's a problem? Fast forward to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He's quoted, "We have a constitutional crisis in Canada." No kidding, sir. So his fix is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which does a lot of renaming of the British North American Act without changing any of the statutes within it. That can be found in the schedule at the very end of the Charter, where it lists all of the things from the British North American Act that it copied and pasted and just changed names. But there was also some other things added to it, obviously. Here's a question. How does Trudeau plan to fix this problem of our constitutional crisis? He can't use his parliament. His parliament doesn't have any authority, technically, because in 1893 it lost its authority. So what does he do? What's his answer? You bring in the Queen. Perfect solution. She can come and make a proclamation, and that'll give it legal footing. Right? That's what happened, isn't it? She came here on April 17th and made a proclamation in 1982. Reading her proclamation gets very, very interesting. About halfway through, I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs. They are very, very interesting paragraphs. And whereas Section 58 of the Constitution Act 1982, set out in Schedule B to the Canada Act, provides that the Constitution Act 1982 shall, subject to Section 59 thereof, come into force on a day to be fixed by proclamation issued under the Great Seal of Canada. That's the first paragraph. If you didn't catch it all in the first reading, I didn't either. Reread it. Re-listen to me reading it if you must. Section 59 must be satisfied before the Charter can take effect. And just to make sure it was drilled into your heads, the next paragraph reads as follows. Now know you that we, by and with the advice of our Privy Council for Canada, do by this our proclamation declare that the Constitution Act 1982 shall, subject to Section 59 thereof, come into force on a day to be fixed by proclamation under the Great Seal of Canada. So, Section 59, this is the Queen's own words in her proclamation that apparently is going to give this whole charter legal footing. Section 59 has to be satisfied. And before we go and read Section 59 and find out what it is and how to satisfy it, I'm going to read you the very next paragraph in her proclamation. It's a short one, and it sounds eerie. Of all which our loving subjects and all other of whom these presents may concern are hereby required to take notice and to govern themselves accordingly. That's the next words she said after telling you that Section 59 has to be satisfied before the charter takes effect. So, what is Section 59 of the charter? The minute you go to Section 59 of the charter, you're sent somewhere else. The very first words you read are commencement of paragraph 23, 1A in respect of Quebec. So you're being sent to another section. It's referencing that. It's a commencement of a paragraph from that section. So it's telling you that you need to reference that first. One of the big problems that some people have is that they go to Section 23, they read what it's about, which we're about to, and they don't go back to 59. They just say, okay, well, that was about something, but it didn't really touch on what we're talking about, so it doesn't really matter. I don't see what the validity is. You have to come back to 59 and keep reading. 59 doesn't just send you somewhere for no reason. It sends you there to find out something and then to come back. So, when you come back, Section 1 of 59 is, paragraph 23 1A shall come into force in respect of Quebec on a day to be fixed by proclamation issued by the Queen or under the Great Seal of Canada. So what is Section 23 1A? This section is a language issue. The whole section, 23 is. But 1A specifically grants the authority to parents to have their children educated in the language of their choice. This flies in the face of how Quebec feels because they want to institute French as their kind of national language. So Quebec wouldn't sign that part. They wouldn't accept that part. I think the Queen might have known that. So Section 23 1A will never be satisfied by Quebec, so it'll never be satisfied. So then you come back and you read that 23 1A shall come into force in respect of Quebec on a day to... Okay, so when they eventually sign off on this, there'll be another proclamation, either by the Queen or her representatives here through the Governor General. You stay reading them. 59. Authorization of Quebec, Section 2. A proclamation under Section 1 shall be issued only where authorized by Quebec. So, Quebec as a legislative body actually has to formally approve 23 1A, and then a proclamation has to be made. There's more. Section 3 is the repeal of this section. This section may be repealed on the day paragraph 23 1A comes into force in respect of Quebec, and this act amended and renumbered. Sorry, it's actually repealed and renumbered. Consequently, upon repeal of this section, by proclamation issued by the Queen or the Great Seal of Canada. So, once Section 23 1A gets satisfied by Quebec, which it hasn't yet, there's a a proclamation to occur. Then Section 59 must be repealed and renumbered. And you see that happen in the Constitution all the time. If you look through, you'll see Section 54 and it'll just say nothing, and then there'll be 54.1 and you'll click on it and it'll be repealed. So that act was repealed, so they repealed and renumbered it. See? So 59 would end up becoming 59.1 and it would be repealed once 23 is satisfied. 23 has to be satisfied and 59 has to be then repealed once it's satisfied. And then a proclamation has to be made by either the Queen or the Governor General before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms takes effect. This means that our Charter of Rights and Freedoms has not yet taken effect. Section 23(1)(a) has not been satisfied, therefore Section 59 of the Charter and Rights and Freedoms has not been satisfied. If you can open up your Constitution, either electronically or on paper, and you can read 59, and it is still there in its entirety, then it has not been satisfied. That means that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms has not taken force, because, as the Queen stated very clearly twice in her proclamation to give it legal footing, because Parliament couldn't, now know you that we, by and with the advice of our Privy Council for Canada, do by this proclamation declare that the Constitution Act 1982 shall, subject to Section 59, therefore, or thereof, come into force. We do not have an active Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was implemented as a constitutional fix for the British North American Act that was actually repealed in 1893. So consider the implications of what this means. From 1893 up until 1982, we were supposed to have been governed when actually we were illegally governed by an entity that didn't have legal authority to do it. And upon further inspection of the apparent constitutional fix done by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, that never took force either. And that almost seems like it was done by design. The British North American Act seems to have been disassembled by design, and that was done by the Crown. The same Crown who demanded and accepted the surrender of the previous charter. You remember, the charter that has a perpetuity in it. That means that it remains active and is governed by its successors and heirs holding the document, which was surrendered to the Crown. It's quite a timeline, but the Crown gave a charter to govern Canada in the 1600s, and it was a corporation. You can read the documents below. Everything I have will be posted down below. They ran as a corporation, and then the Queen wanted it back. So she created a dominion, forced the surrender of their corporation, and accepted their charter in perpetuity, so she's now holding it. And then 20 years later, repealed the act that supposedly forced them to surrender their documents. For about 90 years, this went unnoticed or unchallenged or unchecked or on whatever. I'm sure people challenged it, but Trudeau came around and expressly said, we have a constitutional crisis in Canada. Yeah, we do. The problem is we still do. And when you think about the implications of what that means, you'll start to think differently about the people that are supposedly governing you. The authority to create parliament does not exist. The authority to create these laws and enforce statutes does not exist. This is something that everybody in Canada should start looking into. I implore you to look into this yourself. I will have all of the links posted below, and all of my links are from the Government of Canada, their websites. The only one is the Hudson Bay Charter. That one isn't from a government website, but it is the exact text of the Hudson Bay Charter, and the Hudson Bay Charter is pictured on that website, so you could try to read the old form English if you like, or you can trust that they've translated it. Other than that one document, every other act that I've referenced in its entirety will be posted below, and those links are simply taken from the Government of Canada's website. This is not taken from somebody's Twitter. This is not from the dark web or somebody's conspiracy page on YouTube. This is taken from government documents. All it takes is for you to read it yourself, because you can have as much trust as you have in people, but people lie to you all the time, as I've just pointed out. So take the time to look through the links that I've posted below. Read through it for yourself and let the words sink in. All of it. We do not have a country running here. We have a corporation masquerading as a country operating. It does not have the authority nor the jurisdiction over you as a man or a woman. You need to realize that and be ready to challenge it when it does come knocking at your door. This is not a revolution. This is not an overthrow. This is not a demand for people to step down. This is about how you live your life. This is a corporation that masquerades as a government, and you don't have to do business with them. Just like you don't have to do business with McDonald's if you choose to get your coffee at Tim Hortons. You do not have to do business with the Corporation of Canada if you so choose. So, look into it, find out what it is I'm saying and how much validity there is to it. Make up your own mind, and be aware, because there may be a time when you face a charge, whether justly or unjustly, and I think it's important that you know how to carry out your actual rights, which can be found under common law, and defend yourself. Thanks for listening. I really hope you look into this. Cheers.